And that is the largest element of all this nowadays, because you have a tremendous effort on the part of socialist internationalists today to destroy the nation state. And if you look at Biden and 4 years of an open border and millions of migrants coming in, that wasn't just to get Democratic votes. That was to destroy the national character and culture of the United States so that it would be more malleable and easier to establish an authoritarian regime that would transcend borders and be a truly internationalist state. Same thing happening in Britain right now, same thing happening in Europe, on the European continent. And it is practically unremarked, but unmistakable, that these socialist internationalists, who we call the globalists, we call the left, we call the Democratic Party, they hate Israel and hate Jews. And it's for the same reason, because they are the foremost people in the world who maintain their own identity. And when you're a collectivist, you don't want people to maintain their own identity. You want to impose a single identity on all of them. You remember Chairman Mao's China, and how even everybody from Chairman Mao down to the person who was taking out the garbage in the office of Chairman Mao, they all wore the same clothes, right? Those little uniforms. Why? Because the left is collectivist. They would do that in the United States if they got the chance. They would do that anywhere. China, in doing that, was just acting out the core assumptions of the left's ideas, that equity has to be imposed, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. What's equity? It's not just equality of access, equality of opportunity, it's equality of outcome. So see, you might work harder than me, you might be smarter than me, you might be luckier than me, and you might make a whole lot more money than I do, and then the state that is interested in equity is going to seize some of your money and give it to me so we have the same amount. That's equality of outcome. And that's the socialist state in its essence, that we are all forced onto an equal basis. We're all poor and we're all struggling. And so this collectivist idea, this idea of equity, you have a people that won't conform, that won't submit, that won't assimilate, it doesn't work. And so it's kind of ironic that there is so much support among the Jews in the United States for the left. I respectfully suggest they maybe haven't thought it through, because the left is fundamentally hostile to the very idea of a Jewish identity at all. And that is because of their inherent collectivism. And so these four tendencies are all at play now. I don't think it was a spontaneous thing any more than the campus protests for Hamas, or what Senator Fetterman of Pennsylvania, who's been a marvelous surprise over the last year and a half, he said that they all think they're making a difference by going into pup tents for Hamas. And I thought it was a wonderful phrase, but the pup tents for Hamas are worthy of note because somebody bought them. It's funny how they all had the same tent. They didn't just spontaneously all have the same tent. And so the point is, this all is being paid for by forces that I do not know. I don't think anybody knows ultimately. Probably one name leaps to mind, and we're probably right about it. But in any case, this is a concerted effort. And I would submit that I suggest that it's a concerted effort on the part of powerful forces in the international left today. Because if they destroy Israel and they destroy the United States, then all the rest of the nation states will fall into line. And they will be able to establish their socialist internationalist collective. And so that is the ultimate goal of this recrudescence of anti-Semitism today. So thank you very much. I'll stop there. And if you have any questions or comments, we'll go from that. Now consider this. Imagine that you are a Marxist, socialist, an internationalist, You want to destroy the nation state. You want to establish a socialist state. You want to have total control over the human beings in this state. But you recognize that religion is a very powerful and universal human impulse. And everybody's got one, even the atheists. They just don't call it that. But everybody's got a religion. And you tried to destroy religion. You did that in the French Revolution. It didn't work. You tried that in the Soviet Union, and it didn't work. And so you're not just going to keep making the same mistakes over and over again. You're going to try a different tactic. So what about, instead of destroying religion, which you have realized you cannot do, instead you decide to choose one of the existing religions, one that happens to inculcate absolute obedience to the ruler, and push that religion on everybody else. Now think about this. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, there's a very famous saying where he says, "Obey your ruler, even if he is an Ethiopian with a head like a raisin." And people quote that to say, look, he was a racist. Yes, he was a racist, if he existed at all. Whoever wrote that was a racist. Sure, but that's not the most important aspect of the statement. The most important aspect of the statement is obey your ruler, even if. Obey your ruler, in other words, no matter what, even if he's the most outlandish person that can be thought of, you have to obey him. And Islam lends itself to absolutism, also because of the very idea of Allah, who's this very angry, willful despot who has no restraints. You know, Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher, writes about his frustration in dealing with the Muslim philosophers because they wouldn't accept that A is A. The Aristotelian idea that the book is the book. It's not a horse. And they would say, well, Allah could make it into a horse tomorrow. Well, yes, he could. But then you can't really predicate anything about the universe, which is why Islamic science never actually developed. It's a myth. Science developed in Christian Europe because they understood that a good God would create the universe according to consistent and discernible laws. But in the Islamic world, they thought Allah is absolute will, and consequently, he can do whatever he wants, and you can't count on this universe being the same way tomorrow as it is today. And so Maimonides found them entirely frustrating to deal with. But the idea of science grew up not in the Islamic world for precisely this reason. Anyway, Allah is absolute will, and he has to be obeyed. So this lends itself to absolutism. All right? Now, if you look at history, when have there been secular democracies in the Islamic world? Never. There was one. There was Turkey. 20 years ago, people would say, Turkey is going to be the trendsetter, and it's all going to be okay. In 20 years, they'll all be secular democracies. And now Turkey is re-Islamizing. It was always at war with political Islam. Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, explicitly rejected political Islam because he thought it was responsible for the failure of the Ottoman Empire. And he built modern Turkey on the model of the secular West. But that has been rejected now, not only everywhere else in the Islamic world, but in Turkey as well. So anyway, imagine you have these socialist internationalists. They love Islam because Islam makes for a docile population that will accept tyranny. It always has. And so they encourage Islam, and they bring mass huge numbers of Muslim migrants into the West. And so they don't mind that they won't assimilate. They think they can co-opt them. They're in for a rude awakening. Khomeini allied with the communists, and the communists thought, we're going to have a part in the new government. And then he put them all in prison and killed them. And it'll be the same way. If we lose in the struggle for freedom in the West, then the Muslims will turn on the leftists and kill them. But meanwhile, the leftists think they can ride the tiger. Yes, sir. Hey, Brent. Thank you. Thank you.
A special thank you for your critical Quran. the outstanding translation of the Devil's Book, the Quran. It's really a must read, even though it's 800 pages. But it's easy to read.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Now I can say, yes, I'm the author of the Quran. Although really, it's not really something you want on your resume.
And so what you're saying, it seems like you're talking a lot about the superstructure of anti-Semitism. But I don't know if you're familiar with the writer, director, filmmaker, Rabbi Raphael Shore.
Sure.
Oh, okay. Who just came out with a new thing, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Jew, built more on the idea that the Torah and Hitler agree why there's anti-Semitism. And it's because the Jews brought conscience, morality, empathy, and ethics to the world, and barbarians can't tolerate that. So whenever you're dealing with a barbaric people, it could be Muslims, it could be Nazis, communists, it can be Jews. There are a lot of people I call jihadi Jews now, the leftist Marxist Jews of the university. And so whoever hates God really has to hate the Jew symbolically. It goes through there.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have any problem with that. I think that makes good sense.
Good evening, thank you.
Thank you.
Two things. I'm going to ask you first to parse a civics lesson between the three Abrahamic faiths. You cited the Quranic injunction to obey the leader, albeit the leader's a pinhead. Yeshu ben Yosef is attributed to us in the gospel. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God that which is God. In the Pirkei Avot, part of the Talmud, it says, you have entered the city, abide by its customs. So we have three civic lessons here in terms of the relationship of the individual subordinate to the state. Can you differentiate them?
Yeah, sure. I think so. Anyway, at the risk of hubris, I suppose. But in any case, when you come to the first one, I think I explained that it lends itself to absolutism and to the idea of total obedience and totalitarianism in society. That is the Islamic injunction. It's not actually in the Quran. It's in the Hadith. Muhammad saying, obey your ruler even if he is an Ethiopian with a head like a raisin. Then Jesus saying, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's, is, of course, a much debated saying that many people take as the foundation of the much later idea that did originate in Europe of secular government, that there are areas of the of the government of peoples that are best kept religiously neutral. And this was a result in Europe, of course, of the religious wars between the Catholics and the Protestants, where it was ultimately decided that the individual conscience should be respected to the degree that there would be well, as the Quran puts it, no compulsion in religion, although the Quran doesn't really mean it. But the idea is that the dignity of the human person as created in the image of God is such that the individual's choice is to be respected even if one disagrees. And there's a realm in which there's a religious realm and a secular realm in the government that respects the individual conscience of the varying people with varying points of view. And that has enabled the pluralistic societies of today. And then the third, well, I believe that that's certainly a true statement from Pirkei Avot, that you respect the rules of the house and so on. But at the same time, if that would carry out to its logical conclusion, then you would have no more Jewish people, because they'd be respecting, like I said in the talk, conforming so totally as to give up their particular identity. And so that's always something that I think has had limits within the Jewish tradition.
Yeah, thank you. My view of Islam, or understanding the evolution of Islam, is that basically it took the Jewish messianic idea, and Muhammad is essentially a messianic figure, that the Mashiach is the last messenger of God to announce the messianic age. So they basically took this Jewish principle, which I guess is post-Babylonian exile, and said, okay, this messianic figure has arrived. This is the last messenger. So it's really Mashiach by other means, or recast for that culture.
You could say that, but Muhammad occupies an even greater position in Islam than any messianic traditions that I'm aware of in Judaism or in Christianity for that matter. Because, well, I think that to put it kind of crudely, in many talks I've said that Allah in Islam is Muhammad's sock puppet. That if you read the Islamic traditions, Allah is so deeply concerned for the happiness and well-being of Muhammad that it's very clear that whether these traditions were originally about Muhammad or about somebody else, as I contend in Muhammad, A Critical Biography, and Did Muhammad Exist, that this was a con man who was using his claim to be a prophet of God to give himself all manner of special privileges to a degree that's absolutely ludicrous, such that the whole universe is revolving around the happiness of this one guy. And it's crazy.
Thank you.
But that's another discussion for another day.
We're going to try to get these 3 last questions.
Okay, I'll try to be more brief.
Hi, I have a question for someone, actually a group of people who couldn't be here, and then one is for myself. So I'm actually from UCLA, and there were like a few people who just saw like quotes from your blogs, and they were just wanting to look out for Muslim friends who were actually like, there's a lot of anti-Semitism, but there's also plenty of Muslims on campus who aren't anti-Semitic, and then who are anti-Semitic, but they've been getting attacked simply because of certain quotes that are like definitely coded, but it's not really descriptive of their like entire identity or their sort of values. And so my personal question is, even though there are certain verses within the book that can be, like people can raise awareness about it, okay, we should stay away from this. But when bringing it up in the conversation, like how can it be done in a safe way where people aren't like demonized and they aren't like being attacked? And then the second question is, what would you have to say to people who think you're Islamophobic?
Can I do the second one first?
Yeah.
Islamophobia is a made-up word designed to intimidate people into being afraid to speak out against jihad, terrorism, and violence committed in the name of Islam and in accord with its teachings. It's designed to intimidate and frighten people into silence. That's what I would say to people who say I'm Islamophobic. If what I were saying were not true, if the quotes that I give from the Quran and Muhammad were not true, were not in there, if Muslims weren't acting upon them and quoting them themselves to commit acts of violence all around the world, even today, then there might be a case. But otherwise, it's a term that is designed to inhibit speech and thought, and as such should be resolutely rejected. As far as
Can I actually, sorry to interrupt, can I add like one more comment on that? There's like 2 different things. I agree with your definition of Islamophobia, but there's another Islamophobia that some UCLA students are afraid of, and it's not the one that you were speaking of. It's the Islamophobia that, anybody wearing like a head covering like a woman, they're just immediately looked as, oh, she believes in this. And it's like more of like a fear of immediate like assumption,
Yeah, actually, Islamophobia is also an illegitimate conflation of 2 quite distinct phenomena. One is vigilante attacks against innocent people, which of course are always to be rejected. And the other is honest discussion about the ideological roots of jihad violence. And the same word is used deliberately and maliciously for both in order to conflate the 2 and to give the impression that if you speak honestly about what the content of the Islamic texts and Islamic teachings, that you are thereby condoning or even inciting violence. Well, actually, no, that's not the case. The only incitement of violence is when there's an actual call to violence. And that's true all around. I would not just say that of myself, but of anybody in the world. Muslim, non-Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, atheist. If you say go and attack people, that's incitement to violence. If you say these people are advancing ideas that are based on a holy text that teaches that these people are the enemy and have to be warred against, and if that's true and accurate, then there's no violence in that. And one of the biggest problems on campuses today, UCLA and others, is the conflation of speech and violence. Speech is not violence. And if I am speaking honestly and accurately about the Islamic texts and teachings, that's not violence. If I say go attack somebody, that's incitement to violence. But I've never said that, and I never would say that because I don't believe in that. And so the people who maliciously want to suppress honest discussion of these issues equate speech with violence and say, when you say this, that the Islamic texts say, that the Quran says, kill them wherever you find them, over and over again in chapter 2, verse 191, 489, 491, 95, and then 47:4 says, when you meet the unbelievers, strike the necks. If I say that, I'm not saying go and do anything to anybody. I'm saying this is what the Quran says. But they want you to believe that if I say that, then some poor innocent guy who's a Muslim on campus is going to get attacked. Why? I didn't tell anybody to attack anybody. And he might not believe those things, or he might not take them seriously, or he might have no intention of acting upon them. And so the big problem we have nowadays is that the universities are deliberately, they're not just not teaching how to think, they're deliberately teaching you how to think wrong. And one of the ways they are doing that is by making you think that speech that is unpopular and unwelcome in certain circles is incitement to violence. It isn't. Incitement to violence is incitement to violence. Speech that is unpopular is speech that is unpopular, and that's all that it is.
We're going to try to get the last two.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, mine's quick. In regards to basically lately in the news with Ireland, I know there's sort of been how much of the anti-Israel sentiment there is from the groundswell of Muslims that have kind of flooded that country, and how much
about
of it is
100%.
Huh?
About 100%.
How much of it is also just the where the Catholics, the Protestants, we were pro-Israel, and the Protestants were pro-Israel, so we're against them. The Catholics were pro-Palestinian, so we're pro that. And are there any voices in the Irish Parliament that are pro-Israel? Because if there are, I haven't heard them.
I don't know of any, but I haven't been looking all that closely. I don't know everybody in the Irish Parliament. But certainly there's probably an undercurrent of Christian anti-Semitism that's always been there and hasn't been entirely suppressed over the last half century. I think that's very much a possibility. But the big resurgence in Europe and in the UK and Ireland of anti-Semitism comes from the mass Muslim migration and the left's attempts to accommodate the Muslims because they love them for the reasons I explained earlier.
Final question, Rob?
Final question.
And I will be short, I promise.
I will be, but I always am.
How does the... Yeah, I please go on and on. How does the West protect itself? And indeed, how does the West win?
How does the West protect itself and win? It has to reject the socialist internationalism that led to all this. And so, for example, Trump has closed the border, and that's good. But there are a whole lot of people here who think he's terrible, not here, who think he's terrible for having closed the border, who think that everything he's done has to be reversed, and they will keep fighting. And there's plenty more, of course, that they are still doing to corrode the native culture, to corrode the unity of the people, to make socialist authoritarianism easier to implement. And so we have to fight resolutely against that and be aware of that as happening when most people aren't even aware that it is going on. But you have to understand the open border. If you forget, think about the open border. It wasn't just for Democratic voters. It was to dilute the national character and weaken the country in general so that it would fall and it would be easier to establish the authoritarian regime they want. These people are not idiots. They're evil, but they're not stupid. And so they wouldn't be so short-sighted as to bring in millions of people thinking they'll vote Democratic when there wouldn't even be a vote to have if they all stayed here and changed the system the way that they were likely to do. And so anyway, we got to close. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert.
Here, and God bless you.